material as a result. Okay, so there's 10% of the grade will be participation, and we really do mean this. And that both means showing up to section and showing up to lecture, and I will cold call. One other point is that if anyone has experience with video or for other reasons is interested in being the videographer for the class, we are going to videotape every class and put them up on the website so you guys can review them. So please come see me after the lecture if that interests you. It would require not just that you sit there with that, while you're taking your notes and make sure that it's working right, but also that afterwards you, get on Final Cut Pro or whatever and slice it up and put it up on YouTube. So, okay, so let's get started on the substantive part of the class. So the first reading that you had to do was this piece by Milton Friedman, and I basically wanted you to read this to give you a sense for sort of the power of economic analysis. So Capitalism and Freedom is one of my favorite books, and it was one of the things that really opened my eyes to the power of economics. And of course it's by a very famous University of Chicago economist, so I thought it would be a perfect thing to start off the class with. And I think the assigned chapter is sort of an example of what at its best economic analysis can achieve. And it does it in a completely non-technical way. So it sort of pulls away the veil of mystification that may have fallen over you in economics as a result of your basic training. So basically what Friedman does in this piece is he takes sort of a conventional wisdom, piece of conventional wisdom, which is that doctors should be licensed. He then looks at it from an economic perspective. And on the basis of that, he makes what I think is a quite persuasive argument that the conventional wisdom is totally wrong. Most importantly, perhaps for this class, he uses in that argument a whole series of concepts that are going to be the key things that you're going to learn to manipulate yourselves by taking this class. So my hope is that if you're successful in this class, you'll come out of it able to make arguments like the type of argument that Friedman was making. Let me start by just asking Shin Kim.
Yes.
Yeah. What's Friedman's basic argument in this piece?
He's saying that doctors shouldn't have to be licensed.
Yeah. So, but why? What's his argument for that position? I mean, why does he think that doctors shouldn't be licensed?
Because they tend to, once they're licensed, they tend to form a producer group, and they tend to manipulate that position.
Yeah, so that's basically right. So he says that the main purpose of medical licensure, rather than ensuring doctor quality, is actually to restrict the number of doctors and therefore make a supply that's much greater, demand that's much greater than the supply, so that the wages of doctors rise. And that actually leads to a reduction rather than an increase in the quality of medical care, because now there's so few doctors to serve so many people that everyone ends up getting 5 minutes with their doctor rather than the longer period of focused care that they deserve. And he also argues that almost all the benefits associated with licensure, that is prohibiting people who are not licensed by the government from practicing medicine, would be equally or better served by certification, in which the government says these are good doctors, these are bad doctors, but then doesn't prohibit the bad doctors from practicing. So therefore he opens that medicine should be open to free practice, and that any other system, as Shin was emphasizing, would quickly become too politically manipulated. Even if in principle it could be beneficial to prohibit certain people from participating, in the end it's going to end up being controlled by the medical association, which is not going to have an interest in increasing the quality of care, but instead an interest in raising the wages of doctors. So, Abigail, what are sort of the steps that Friedman goes through in making this argument?
Let's see. He goes over barbers and the license of the barbers.
Yeah.
Then he talks about the different stages, like licensing proper. Then he talks about the difficulties and benefits of certification, and then talks about the justifications for certification.
Yeah, so what I think I was trying to get at is there's sort of different components in sort of the stages of how he makes the argument. So the first component is that he tries to argue that by reducing the quantity of doctors, that will benefit the people who are currently doctors, right? And the reason is that when there are less doctors, the wages of doctors rise. But this is not just going to harm people who are paying for medical services and benefit people who are currently doctors, but it's actually going to harm the people who want to buy medical services and who want to be doctors but are prohibited from being doctors more than it will benefit the doctors. So why does he say that? Well, because basically there are some people who are willing to pay more than some other people who are willing to, when the price rises, there are people who are willing to pay less than the current price of medical services, and other people who are willing to work as a doctor for less than the current price. And those people could benefit from interacting with one another, but are prohibited from doing so by the restriction that people aren't allowed to work unless they're licensed. And so this means that there's both an incentive for and a big social harm created by the licensing of the doctors, right? Because the doctors, yeah.
I was just going to say that he does make the argument, well, he goes on to criticize the argument. There exists the argument that you have to keep doctors' wages artificially high so that they won't fall into unethical practices.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to say that there's no correlation really between those two things.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a common argument made for professional association, that sort of that people who are making extra money aren't in sort of a rat race, but he argues that that's not really an important factor. What's your name, by the way?
Federico.
Okay. Now, Friedman then argues that if this was really beneficial to consumers, this licensing, we would expect Chet? Where's Chet? Chet Lubarsky? Okay. So just skip over that. But so basically, what Friedman does is he argues that that if these licensure rules were really beneficial to consumers, it would be consumer groups who would be lobbying in favor of licensure. But in fact, what we usually see is the doctors lobbying in favor of licensure. And this is actually a pretty sharp contrast, because if you think about other areas of regulation, usually it's the consumer groups lobbying in favor, and it's the companies that are regulated lobbying against them. So that should sort of already set off some alarm bells about who's really benefiting from this type of a system. Now, Benjamin Jacobson? Yeah, hey. So what does Friedman say about the particular requirements that are required of people in order to be a doctor, and how those line up with what you would expect if the system were really working well?
A lot of the requirements are what the consumer really cares about.
For example, can you, what?
I don't remember any.
Or can you think of an example in real life, just,
Being a
you know,
US
from your...
citizen, I think he talks about being a US citizen being a requirement, which has no bearing on it. Or
Yeah, and he
speaking-
also talks
speaking
about,
English.
you know, communism.
Oh,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so there's, he gives this example that you're required, you know, if you're a communist, then you're not allowed to be a doctor. Another example, I think, is much more broadly, which is, I don't know if any of you are pre-med, but like you're required to take all this physics and chemistry and this and that. And like, sure, those things might be relevant if you end up wanting to be like a research doctor or something like that. But if you think about like, you know, a surgeon or like someone doing stitches, probably much more important things, like you have really fine hands. And so really you should be required to be like a ping pong master in order to get into medical school, rather than being, you know, good at physics, right? I mean, what does it have to do with like a lot of what doctors end up doing? So this indicates that the goal, yeah, hey,
Well, just on that point,
yeah,
I really disagree with the way he made his argument.
yeah,
That he also talked about how some of the things that doctors do be better performed by people who are specialized technicians.
Yeah.
And all them. And I thought, you know, part of the reasons as a pre-med they make you do all these
Yeah.
things is because often in medicine situations arise that are, you know, that aren't textbook, so to speak.
sure,
So you often have to, it's like you often have to reason through the problem.
yeah. What's your name?
Effects.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good potential counter-argument. My guess is that Friedman would counter that by saying that, you know, you can have some generalist physicians around. Like, think about what you have at most companies, right? Like a steel mill. Surely there's cases in steel mills where things end up going to hell, you know, because some machine goes off the thing, and that's why you have a manager there who's like has a broader range of experience and knows what to do. But most of the people have to be trained in doing their particular task. And I think that, you know, there's a pretty strong case to be made that you could have like a nurse giving normal stitches, and then if there's some complication from the stitches, you can have a doctor sitting back there who sort of like, you know, knows what to do. Yeah.
Oh, also I was going to say, I think he would say people are intelligent enough to do their own research and find out whether a doctor is well reviewed. So they won't go to somebody who doesn't really know what he's doing.
Yep. Yeah, no, that makes sense. What's your name?
Luke?
Luke. Okay. Yeah.
Speaking on the competency
Yeah.
example when he goes to lawyers and how like day school versus night school.
Yep.
That when you go to say that you know
Yeah.
a night law school is much less expensive than a regular
Yeah.
law school. So by you saying, oh no, he's not competent because he only went to night school rather than day school, they're not
Yeah.
only pricing out because of that, but you know because people who can't afford to go to law school, they can't become a lawyer.
Yeah.
So it's kind of they're using an argument about competence to sort of as a mask for pricing people out of the market.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. What's your name?
Max Vicia.
Did you have a question? Okay, great. So then, and one thing that I think Friedman emphasizes in this, which is something that shows up in a lot of areas of economics, is what the Doctors Association really tries to do is sort of hijack other ethical views we have. Like, you know, you might be an anti-communist and think we don't want communists running around this country, right? And so the doctors are able to get away with like keeping the communists out of medicine, even though that's like completely irrelevant to the issue of whether someone's going to be a good doctor or not. But if it allows them to reduce the competition for their services, that's beneficial. Another example of that is, you know, a lot of people sort of drum up anti-immigrant or other sort of nationalistic, xenophobic sentiment against Mexican workers because they're facing competition from them for certain, you know, types of labor. And they don't frame it in terms of the economic competition, they frame it in terms of, well, no one's speaking English in our country anymore, they're, you know, polluting our culture, etc. But the real motivation behind it is more economic. Another part of Friedman's argument is that consumer interests tend to be much more diffuse than producer interests. What does that mean? Each consumer probably only spends a tiny part of his income on buying medical services, right? But every doctor gets all of his income from being a doctor, right? And so the doctors have a much bigger incentive to try to make sure that there's no competition than consumers do to make sure that there is competition. And this means that consumers don't end up preventing abuse very much. And this is also a broader principle in economics, that very often consumer interests are much more diffuse than producer interests. This doesn't always argue in favor of sort of pro-free market things the way Friedman does. If you think about the regulation of the financial sector, that was, you know, way underregulated, I think most of us would think, and it was largely because the consumers were so diffuse and the